Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. In our previous lecture, we began talking about the difficulty of defining exactly what myth is and how it functions. In this lecture, we are going to continue our discussion of what myth is and how it can be defined. And in particular, we are going to look at several of the most influential theories about myth that have developed in the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. As I said in the previous lecture, the question, what is myth, has no easy or obvious answer. One thing that we can dispense with right away is the usage of the term myth in popular speech to mean a lie or a misconception or a mistaken belief. That does not concern us here. For instance, if somebody says love at first sight is just a myth, what they mean is that is something along the lines of that is a mistaken belief or a misconception. It doesn't really happen. That is a very common usage of the term myth, but clearly that is not what we are dealing with here. Despite the fact that myth is so difficult to define precisely, what most people seem to have is a sense that there is such a category as myth, that we are not just chasing a chimera here, that there is rather a category as myth, and most people do have a sense that they know it when they see it, or that when they are told a myth or they read a story that is a myth, they do have a sense that somehow there is a difference here between that story and other kinds of stories that they may be told or maybe have read. We can try to begin to close in on what myth is, what that difference is between myth and other forms of story, and how we know it when we see it by identifying some characteristics of myth to supplement the working definition that I gave in my previous lecture. If you remember, that definition started by saying that myths are traditional tales or stories that a society tells itself. Let's think about the implications of the term traditional tales. Myths are tales, they are stories. That may seem so obvious that it doesn't need to be said, but it is worth focusing on. There are many forms of human communication that are not stories. Even if they follow a logical narrative, they are not necessarily stories. These lectures, for instance, I hope follow a logical narrative order, but they are not stories, despite the fact that they are communication. Myth is a story. If something is not a story, it is therefore not a myth. I would just push that far enough to say that a representation of a myth in artwork is just that. For instance, if one were to see a representation of the birth of Venus, the Greek name, of course, would be Aphrodite. That is not a myth of the birth of Aphrodite. That is a representation of a myth. So myths are stories, and they are traditional stories. I touched on this pretty thoroughly in the last lecture, but here it's worth pointing out one implication of that. And that is that stories handed down from generation to generation in a society normally cannot be attributed to any one author or any one originator. To put that in another way, it is usually impossible to tell who first thought up a story that becomes a myth. That means that one major difference between myths and other stories that we may be more familiar with, such as novels, plays, poems, that kind of thing, is that we don't know who invented a myth. It is traditional. It is changed over time, handed down through generations. Obviously, if you think about that logically, there must have been someone who first told any story that later becomes a myth. The point is, though, that the someone here has been lost in time. We don't know who it was who invented a myth. Going along with the idea that myths are traditional tales handed down through time is another characteristic that is very important of myth, namely that myths are stories dealing with the past. Myths do not deal with what is happening today or this week or even last year. We don't have myths about current events. Myths are set in the past, often in the very remote past, frequently in the time before the world was set in the way that it was going to be from there on out. As part of being set in the past, myths very frequently reflect a sense that in the remote past, things were quite different than they are now. Very frequently, the idea is that in the remote past, things were much better than they are now, that there was perhaps some kind of golden age that we have now lost. Almost invariably, things in myth are different than they are now. Gods and humans interact more freely. Things in the world are still in flux. People can still turn into trees from time to time, that sort of thing. Myths deal with, therefore, with a time when the order of the world is different than it is now, a great deal different oftentimes than it is now, and that time is set in the remote past. Another characteristic of myth that we touched on in the last lecture, but that is worth bringing out in more detail now, is that they are ostensibly true. They present themselves within the society in which they developed as factual accounts of how things actually happened in the remote past in which they are set. It would be very rare for any culture to recognize its own mythology as mythology. In fact, once a culture looks at its own traditional stories and says, these are our myths, I think it is justified to say that culture no longer believes in those myths as a living entity. And therefore, they are not really myths in an active sense. And if we were to put that in another way, which is somewhat paradoxical, but I think it is a valid statement, it is to say that myth is therefore a category that really only exists when you are outside a culture looking in. From within a culture, myths are accounts of the way things really are. But it is only when we step outside of a culture and look at it from the outside that we can say these stories are myths. We can think of maybe some terms in our own modern day society that help us understand this, that this idea of the category that only exists from the outside. A terrorist, for instance, is a label that a person who is not on the side of that person calls him. Nobody calls themselves a terrorist. They might call themselves a freedom fighter. They might call themselves part of the resistance or something like that. But a terrorist is only what somebody from outside of that side would call a person. Conspiracy theorist has the same kind of thing. A person who is a conspiracy theorist doesn't think of themselves as a conspiracy theorist. They think of themselves as telling the truth about something. So it is a category that only exists from outside looking in. Myth functions in the same way. Additionally, what do these stories do, these tales that people tell? Why do they tell them? Well, myths do many things. Among the most obvious functions they fulfill is that myths often explain, justify, instruct, or warn. Explanatory myths are often called etiological myths, a fine highfalutin word that comes from the Greek word aition, which means cause. Explanatory myths may explain why things are the way they are, how certain events or entities came into being, why conditions of the world are as they are. Perhaps the most obvious and most famous etiological myth of classical mythology is the story of Demeter, the goddess of grain and the harvest, kind of like a Mother Nature figure, who grieves for her lost daughter Persephone, who had been kidnapped by Hades, the kind of king of the underworld, king of the dead. And when Persephone is locked in Hades, in the underworld with Hades, her husband, Demeter, her mother, grieves, and therefore no grain grows. But that only happens for a little bit of the year, around wintertime. During spring, summer, and into early fall, when Persephone comes back to spend those 2/3 of the year with her mother, Demeter is happy again and the grain grows again. We're going to have a whole lecture dedicated to that myth, and we will read the sources that tell us that story. But the point here is that very clearly, this is an etiology for why there are seasons, why there is a time of the year when nothing grows. And this myth gives an explanation as to why that should be so. Another function that myths fulfill is to offer a justification for a certain ritual or social institution, a certain rite in honor of a goddess or a god, a social institution such as marriage, and so on. Myths that provide justification for social rites or institutions are very frequently called charter myths. Myths may also instruct their audience in how the audience ought, or more frequently ought not, to behave. Myths very frequently instruct through presenting horrible warnings of what is likely to happen to people who transgress the boundaries of proper human behavior. Thus, myths provide instruction on how humans ought and ought not to behave. They don't do that explicitly. They don't come right out and say, this is what you ought or ought not to do. And that is part of their power. It is through the narrative line of the story, through the events of the story, the depictions of what happens and the characters and their misfortunes and sufferings, which they bring upon themselves for acting in a way that they should have not acted, that it is through this that the audience draws its own conclusions about proper behavior. or very frequently through seeing improper behavior. Obviously, myths very frequently concern gods and the supernatural. Though drawing on my discussion in the first lecture of the division into myth, legend, and folktale, I do not say that myths have to involve gods and the supernatural, but certainly very frequently they do. Here, we are in an area of myth that overlaps with religion, and it can be quite difficult to determine whether a particular narrative should be called a myth or should be studied as part of the Greek religion. One useful distinction of categorization is to say that religion refers to what people actually do to honor the gods, the rites, the ceremonies, the rituals, and so forth that people enact in honor of the gods, whereas myth refers to the underlying narratives, the narratives that explain or justify or go along with those rites, rituals, and ceremonies. Now, here again, the categorization of certain narratives about gods or divinities as myths depends entirely upon the observer's stance with regard to the divinities or gods in question. Again, we might remind ourselves of what I just said, that looked at from inside of the culture, certain stories can be profound, in fact, crucial in terms of their worldview, and they are believed to express truth. But looked at from the outside of the culture, those same stories can be characterized as myth. It depends entirely on the audience member's stance with regard to the religion in question, whether a particular religious narrative is a true narrative or a myth. And as I said before, myth is therefore a category that only exists from outside looking in. We're going to see, though, that this does not apply to Christianity because of the extreme historical, factual details upon which Christianity is based. That is going to, we'll focus on that kind of off and on throughout the course together, but we will see that one of the attributes of, as we said before, about myth being set in the distant past in a way that is kind of lost to the, in the mists of time, that is to be contrasted in the most strongest terms from the very real and very detailed emphasis and narrative events that can be confirmed by archaeology and names, dates, places, geography as found in the New Testament. But we will look at that as all getting ahead of ourselves. From antiquity onwards, many scholars have come up with theories that attempt to define myth or to explain how myth functions, why it functions as it does, what it is that myth is doing. And even as I was working on these lectures, it occurred to me really that the most important theories of myth that developed in the 19th and 20th centuries could very broadly be divided into two main types of theories, which, for simplicity's sake, I am going to call what theories and why theories. This is a very broad categorization, and there is certainly overlap between the two types, but here's what I mean by that terminology. What theories attempt to explain myth by identifying it as a subcategory, a derivative or a forerunner of something else, such as history, ritual, philosophy, and that kind of thing. At their worst, these theories are excessively reductive. What theories tend to say that myth is only misunderstood history, or is only primitive science, or is only the first attempt at philosophy, or something like that. These theories have a tendency to become overly reductive. For example, there was a Greek thinker who we will be spending more time with towards the end of our course, named Euhemerus, who lived around 300 BC, who first suggested that all myths were originally misremembered history. The gods of Greece, he said, had actually been great kings who lived way back in prehistory and whose characteristics had been greatly exaggerated through time. So Zeus, for instance, had been a very great king, according to Euhemerus, and his people recounted his stories through time, recounted his legends. They exaggerated his characteristics until he became Zeus, the great god, the primary Olympian who hurls the thunderbolt, father of gods and men, and so on. Later versions of this theory, and this is one that has had a very long run, it keeps popping up even into the 20th and 21st century, is the idea that of euhemerism, that myth is misremembered history. After Euhemerus, the first inventor of the theory, we see it again and again. Even at its best, though, euhemerism and other what theories tend to ignore the essential quality, whatever it is that makes us recognize myth as myth. In attempting to explain myth by saying it is nothing but misremembered history, Euhemerus really explains nothing at all. Even if we were to grant him for a moment that myth is really only misremembered history, that Zeus was just a great king, Euhemerus has not told us why the story of that great king developed into the story of the numinous, awe-inspiring king who hurls the thunderbolt. Even if he is right that it did, that Zeus was only a king whose story developed into the story of a god, he hasn't explained why that sort of thing should happen, what it is that makes that particular kind of story, that sort of thing appealing. Now, on the other hand, the why theories, as opposed to what theories, look for wider explanation. They try to identify the impetus within the human mind or human culture that motivates myth-making. Psychological and structuralist theories fall under this heading of what I call why theories. Why theories generally assume that myth is an extracultural or transcultural phenomenon. And by that I mean they tend to assume that the same narrative elements serve the same function in different cultures, so that a story about a snake is going to have the same resonance, the same meaning, the same function in different cultures, according to the why theorists. So if what theories suffer from being overly reductionist, why theories tend to suffer from being overly general and therefore overly vague, from saying that the same stories mean the same thing in all cultures at all times, and therefore we don't need to demonstrate that, we can simply assume it. And I'll talk more about why theories in the second half of this lecture. But as I've already said, there is some overlap between these two types of theories, and as we shall see, what theories were more common in the 19th century, mesmerized as the 19th century was by science and the scientific method, whereas why theories became much more common in the extremely psychologically oriented 20th century. And that should, I think, come as a surprise to nobody. Charting them a little bit, just kind of giving you an overview of some of these what theories. One very popular what theory that has been resurrected over and over again since antiquity, and which we will also look at towards the end of our course in antiquity, is the theory that myths are simply a form of allegory. That when a mythic narrative talks about Demeter and Persephone, it is really talking about something else. This overlaps, of course, with the idea of etiological myths, but allegory and the allegorical theory of myth says again that this is true for all myths, that they are all allegorical, and they are all purely meant to be taken as referring to something other than what they are actually talking about. The most famous allegorical theory of interpretation of myth in the modern age was developed in the 19th century by a scholar named Max Müller. Müller came up with what is often called the solar mythology theory. According to Müller, not only were myths misunderstood allegories, but they were misunderstood allegories about one particular thing, the battle between light and darkness, specifically sunlight and darkness. And therefore the name that is given to them is solar mythology, the solar mythology theory. Müller claimed that all classical myths were, in their origins, statements about the sun rising in the morning and putting the darkness to flight. Even so sophisticated and complex a narrative as Homer's Odyssey, for instance, according to Müller, was at its heart a statement about the sun rising and chasing away the night. Odysseus's battles with gods and monsters, his adventures, his homecoming, all represented the sun overcoming darkness. In a phrase that would become infamous, Müller said that mythology was actually eine Krankheit der Sprache, a disease of language. And by that, he meant that as terms change their meaning through time, the people within Greek culture lost sight of the original meanings of statements and started to misinterpret them as statements about anthropomorphic entities. An example will clarify what I mean here. Müller claimed that when, in the early stages of Greek society, someone in a poem such as Homer made the statement, "Maiden dawn arose," the term maiden in that context simply meant early. As the word changed its meaning through time and came to mean a young unmarried female, the statement "maiden dawn arose" was misinterpreted to mean there is a female, young, divine entity called Dawn, and she got up, arose from her bed, and put darkness to flight. Therefore, according to Müller, all mythology is at heart a disease of language of this kind, and mythology is simply a statement about the sun and darkness, a kind of outgrowth of this original primary meaning. Müller's theory was extremely influential in the 19th century, but nobody, and I think that is safe to say, believes it today. It is no longer taken as valid by any scholar of myth. And even in his own day, the primary, or shortly thereafter, really, the primary challenge to Müller's theory in the 19th century was mounted by another great and famous 19th century scholar, Andrew Lang, who saw explanation as the essential function of myth, not allegory. He said that myths were not misunderstood statements of something else, but rather myths were attempts at explaining phenomena that could not otherwise be explained. Myth, Lang thought, was driven by the same impulse that would later develop into science. He said that myth was primitive science, so as Euhemerus had said, myth was misremembered history. Lang said, no, it is not history, it's science. It is primitive science, science that has not yet developed the scientific method, and this means that all myths, according to Lang, were basically etiological. They were all essentially explanations of causes of things and how things came to be as they were in the natural world without really any real understanding of how those things happened. So it's just an attempt to try to explain them. Well, one of the most influential theorists of myth, and one of the most famous theorists of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, was a fellow named Sir James Frazer. Frazer modified the idea of myth as explanation to argue that myth in all societies was specifically an explanation for ritual. He thought that very frequently myths were narratives about rituals written after the rituals had fallen into disuse. And so therefore, very frequently, one could not identify the ritual to which a myth had originally been attached. The narratives were made after the rituals had been performed and then forgotten about. He saw myth's original function, therefore, as an explanation of ritual. I'm oversimplifying here, but that is, and with all of these theories, this is the basic outline of these things. In Frazer's case, his main work was something called The Golden Bough, and it is an extraordinarily complex work. Its first edition was 2 volumes, but by the time he published the third, it had grown to 11 volumes. And therefore, trying to summarize the thesis of an 11-volume work in 2 minutes is very difficult. You can, incidentally, read the entire thing or listen to the entire thing on Audible. The whole thing is out there on Audible. But Frazer's most important strand of argument was his claim about what he called the king of the wood. This was, in his way of examining things, a human king who supposedly in early societies represented or embodied a kind of vegetation god, the god who caused all things to grow, plant fertility, human fertility, animal fertility. Frazer's theory was that society originally had rituals in which an actual human being called the king, and who was a king for 1 year, he embodied this vegetation spirit and was then killed by his successor, because you couldn't have a god who embodies fertility being very, very old and growing old. So he, in this ancient society, as Frazer envisioned it, he would be killed each year by another young successor. Frazer claimed to demonstrate the prevalence of this mythic pattern throughout human society by gathering examples from all sorts of different cultures. The Golden Bough was a pioneering work of scholarship in that regard, picking myths from all over the world. However, Frazer's methodology was grievously flawed. In particular, he collected examples from various cultures, but then ripped them entirely out of context. He assumed that the slightest resemblance of narrative detail must mean precisely similar ritual function, which is a very big and faulty assumption to make, that a narrative detail in one society must function precisely the same as another detail functions in another society. That is a very large assumption to make, and no scholar today would accept Fraser's work in its entirety, at least. Although, as I said, he was a pioneering scholar, and his work was fascinating for many people and can still be looked at as an element in the history of scholarship, and in particular, the scholarship on mythology. Fraser's work was also the inspiration for a whole so-called school of myth theory, often referred to as the Cambridge School or the Cambridge Ritualists. Centered in Cambridge, England, these scholars in the early 20th century saw ritual as the primary motivating force for myth, though they disagreed with Fraser about which rituals were most important. After Fraser, the next most important school of myth theory was called functionalism, which was pioneered by a scholar named Bronislaw Malinowski. Malinowski happened to be marooned on the Trobriand Islands during World War I. Actually, he was there before World War I doing some anthropological study, and then World War I broke out, and so therefore he couldn't get back to Europe until the war ended. Making a virtue out of necessity, while he was there for all those years, he decided to study the indigenous myths of the Trobriand Islanders in their native habitat. He learned their language, even though there was no books in it, which is really an amazing thing. He talked to the people and decided, after all of this intense study, that the defining characteristic of myth is its functionalism. That is, its functionality within a society. And that is why his school of thought is called functionalism. He said that far from trying to explain things or even being allegories or necessarily being connected with rituals, myths were functional. In particular, myth contributes to society, according to Malinowski, by helping to maintain the social system. Its origin is less important than its function. In fact, Malinowski denied not only that myths' primary purpose is to explain, he even said that they had no meaning outside of themselves, that they do not refer to anything outside themselves and the societies in which they function. Their main purpose, in fact, only is to help justify and maintain the social system in which they arise. This is, in a way, if you think about it, almost opposite to Fraser's idea. That is, that the same narrative elements cross-culturally and across time indicate the same mythic impulse. Malinowski would say, myth is purely limited to the culture in which it arises. It justifies, explains, and provides a charter for the social system in which it originates. Charter myths, according to Malinowski, provide a validation for the social institutions they describe, and that is their main, indeed their only function. It was Malinowski who posited the hard and fast distinction, actually, between myth, legend, and folktale that I talked about in the first lecture. Because among the Trobriand Islanders, he found that they themselves, that is, the people who recounted their own traditional tales to him, made this distinction themselves between myth as stories about the gods, legend as stories about heroes or great men who had once lived, and folktale as stories purely for entertainment. He thought that this distinction was valid cross-culturally, and that is, that in all societies we should categorize only stories about the gods as myths and other traditional tales as either legend or folktale. However, as I said in the first lecture, that distinction does not apply nearly so well to classical myth as it apparently applies to native myths of the Trobriand Islands. Each of these theories, which I have gone through now, has struck its critics as unsatisfactory in at least some regards. Some of the theories seem way too restrictive. The most obvious example is the solar mythology theory of the 19th century. That one is sort of easy to make fun of because it is so restrictive. It seems obvious to us that whatever myth is doing, it must be doing something more than saying the sun rises every morning and then goes away. But further theories, too, fall short in this regard. For instance, if myths must be tied to rituals, as Fraser and the Cambridge School posited, and myth implies ritual, myth is myth is simply the narrative that goes along with ritual, then what do we do with traditional stories that seem to have no ritual association whatsoever? In classical myth, for instance, the struggles of the gods for power, which we will talk about when we get to Hesiod's Theogony, as far as we know, have no connection with any ritual that ever happened. Are they then not myths? How do we account for stories that are not connected with rituals? If myths must concern the gods, how do we account for stories about Oedipus, Perseus, and Theseus? Many of the most famous myths, indeed, of Greek mythology deal directly with heroes and do not deal with gods. If myths must prove charters for social institutions, as Malinowski posited, how do we explain myths that don't seem to perform any such function? Again, take, for example, that one I gave at the beginning of this lecture today, the birth of Aphrodite from the sea, Venus on a half-shell. What social institution finds its charter in that story? I can't think of one. Certainly there is no obvious answer, if any. Therefore, with all of these objections, in each case, the theorist would probably say that any stories that don't fit the theory are by definition not myths at all, but some other type of story. This narrowing of the definition to make the theory work, though, is not very satisfactory to someone who is not already bought into the theory. If I wanted to, I could say, for the purpose of this course, I define myths as stories about entities whose names begin with A. I could say if a story is not about a god whose name begins with A, it is not a myth then. So I'm only going to be talking about Aphrodite, Artemis, Achilles, and so forth. And as I was trying to, elucidate with all this, that sort of limiting of the definition is really taking the very easy way out and is obviously leaving a lot to be desired in terms of explanatory force. Another answer, and one that most theorists would say deserves more attention, is to say that in any case where there is no apparent match of the myth to the ritual or the myth to the charter to justify some social institution, then the myth has undergone change or corruption, which has disguised its original character. Malinowski would probably answer my objection about the birth of Aphrodite by saying that it did provide a charter for some social institution. We just don't know what that was. Likewise, the Cambridge ritualists would probably say about my objection to the story of the gods' struggle for power that there were rituals to match those myths. We just no longer have any evidence to match those rituals. This, again, though, is a form of special pleading, and it is persuasive only to those who have already accepted the theory in question. If we accept that all myths must be tied to ritual, if we take that as our first premise, then when we find a myth that does not seem to be tied to ritual, we have no recourse except to say that we don't know what the ritual was. If we don't start with the first premise that myth must be tied to ritual, then it certainly looks as though many myths are not. These theories tend to require acceptance of the theory first, and some manipulation of the evidence second to make the theory work, which is troubling to many scholars. Therefore, it seems to me better to admit that so far, no monolithic theory of myth so far has completely defined or explained what myth is. Someone may yet come up with such a theory, but it has not been done yet. And therefore, having continued trying to determine what myth is, and having surveyed a very few important what theories, I would now like to move on to looking at some of the most important why theories of the 20th century, specifically psychological and structuralist theories. We began our examination of some of the most important theories about myth by looking at what I call what theories of myth. And as I say now, we're going to move on to why theories of myth and look at the psychological theories of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, the structuralist approaches of Vladimir Propp, Claude de Lévi-Strauss, and Walter Burkhardt. We will also discuss the work of the one-time very popular theorist Joseph Campbell. Well, the 20th century saw the development of crucially important, extremely influential, and very complex theories about myth, which fall under the category of what I call why theories. Again, all I can do is scratch the barest of surfaces here with these theories, but we will begin with the psychological theories of Freud and Jung, and then move on to structuralist theories. The thing that these why theories have in common is that they assume myth reflects the underlying human realities within culture, and that myth, therefore, is somehow cross-cultural or trans-cultural, rather than being specific to the individual culture in which it develops. Let us begin with Sigmund Freud. Among his other contributions to modern thought, Freud proposed that myth reflects psychological forces present in the individual and through the individual present in society. His most infamous contribution to the study of myth was his interpretation of Sophocles' treatment of Oedipus the king, through which he developed his own theory of the Oedipus complex. Freud developed the Oedipus complex theory after he posited, or rather asked himself, why it was that Sophocles' tragedy, Oedipus the king, was still so compelling, still so electrifying to modern audiences 2,500 years after it was written. The common interpretation that was given by most critics of his time was that the play was so compelling and so electrifying because it explored the interaction of fate versus free will. And that is what made it so compelling. The fact that Oedipus, by trying to avoid his fate, when he is told, we find out in the play that he was told as a child that he will grow up to kill his father and marry his mother. And so he tried to run away from his fate as far as possible, run away from the people that he thought were his parents. But by doing so, he actually ran all the more into his fate and wound up fulfilling that destiny, even though he didn't want to. This was the explanation that most critics at the time posited as to why it was such a compelling and electrifying play. Freud disagreed with this. Freud said that could not explain its popularity because there are other dramas written about this interaction of fate and free will that are not as compelling, that do not retain their popularity centuries or even decades after they are written. And of course, even in the classical period itself, Aristotle, the philosopher, in his work, The Poetics, actually uses he uses Sophocles' Oedipus the king as the ideal model for a Greek tragedy. It basically says that it reaches the kind of perfection of what Greek tragedy should be. And therefore, Freud thought that the appeal of the story of Oedipus must lie not in the fate-free will issue, but in something specific to its narrative, in the details of the story rather than its wider issues. And of course, the details of the Oedipus story are that Oedipus killed his father and married his mother, and Freud saw this as reflecting the desires of all male children to do this same thing. According to Freud, not just the Oedipus myth, but myths in general are in effect the collective dreams of the human race. And by that, he meant that he thought myths utilized the same kind of imagery, same kind of condensation and displacement that we find in our own individual dreams. He thought that the imagery of myth was similar to the imagery of dreams, and in both cases, Freud thought that this imagery was primarily sexual in nature. This is basically Freud's whole kind of focus on everything, basically. And Oedipus is a story about, at least in part, this sort of thing. So this kind of, this focus. The second psychological theorist of the 20th century to grapple with myth was Carl Jung, who was actually at one point a colleague, an associate of Freud, but they split over this very issue because of Freud's kind of obsession with sex and how he saw that as being the main operative psychological drive inside of everybody that basically explains everything. Jung saw myths rather in a different way. He saw them as reflections of what he called the collective unconscious. In particular, Jung thought that myths draw upon archetypes, which are contained in the collective unconsciousness. And by archetypes, he meant more or less, and again, I'm simplifying, reoccurrent images that exist cross-culturally and throughout time. Images such as the image of the wise old man, the earth mother, the maiden, the young man who goes on the quest, that sort of thing. Jung thought that myth utilizes these images, these archetypes, and we find myth compelling because we too partake of the archetypes as we partake of the collective unconscious. Because myth, according to Jung, reflected the myths of the collective unconscious. He thought that myths were crucially important both for the individual and for society, that they have explanatory power for deeper psychological themes, deeper kind of thrusts of the human mind, and so on. He probably accorded more importance to myth than Freud did. The psychological approach is only one universalist, or as I call them, Y approaches to myth. The other main school of thought that has developed around myth in the 20th century is what is called structuralism. Structuralism is very difficult to define briefly and simply. The best definition that I have found is given by the scholar Walter Burkert, who says that, quote, structuralism is a system of definable relations between the parts or elements of a whole which admit predictable transformations. That is a little complicated, so let's parse that. According to structuralism, the component elements, that is, the system of definable relations between the parts or elements of a whole, will interact with each other in predictable ways. Whether the whole we are talking about is society in general, or language, or in our case, myth, or some other system, structuralism says that in every one of these cases, its individual parts will interact with one another in a predictable manner. There are two varieties of structuralist theory that I want to look at here. The first is often called the formalist school, though some people separate it from structuralism entirely and call it formalism instead. It was developed by a Russian folklorist named Vladimir Prop, who analyzed traditional Russian folktales based on their surface elements, based on the actual narrative elements that appear in these tales. So, looking at Russian folktales, Prop found one basic pattern of tales, which he called the quest pattern, which he further analyzed into 31 elements, or as he calls them, 31 separate functions. An important thing to understand about Prop's kind of analysis and about formalist analysis in general is that he is not saying that every single tale would have all 31 of these functions. One story might have some of them. So they might have, I don't know, say functions 2, 3, 5, 7, 8, 9, 13, 15, and so forth. Whereas another tale might have functions 1, 2, 7, 8, 10, 11, 12, 15, and 17, and so forth. But when you study the entire body of tales, you find the same functions, and they appear in the same order. Therefore, it is the sequence of functions which creates or defines the tale for a formalist analysis, not the characters who happen to appear in the tale. The characters are not the tale's defining characteristic. It's the functions of these different parts that come, as you can see on the screen in front of you, certain kinds of, the difficult task comes before the solution, then the recognition, then the exposure, and so on. I'll give you an example to try to clarify all this. We could say that a tale in a formalist analysis may include the elements, if we go for Vladimir Prop's quest pattern. If we take make a formal analysis of a formalist analysis of a tale, that may include elements of a young man being driven out of his home by a wicked elder male relative, going on a journey in which he encounters several monsters or enemies of some kind, killing at least one of those monsters, and as a reward for those efforts being given the hand of a princess in marriage. Whether we call that hero Jason from Jason and the Argonauts, or Perseus, or Prince Charming, or Luke Skywalker, makes very little difference. The tale, the story is the same, and that is the basic understanding of formalism, that a tale is basically made up of these elements that have predictable patterns within a structure. The second main category of structuralism And in fact, what most people are talking about when they talk about a structuralist approach to myth looks at the underlying structure of the myth rather than at the surface narrative of a myth. This approach was developed by a Frenchman named Claude Lévi-Strauss. The main point of Lévi-Strauss's theory is his claim that myth exists to, quote, mediate contradictions. It's a very important phrase in his thinking. That is, human society and human thought in general operate through a series of binary oppositions, and that myth and other structures in society exist to mediate these structures and these oppositions. Oppositions such as those between nature and culture, which Lévi-Strauss says appears in, among other ways, in the opposition, for instance, between raw food and cooked food, raw food standing for nature and cooked food standing for culture. Another set of contradictions or oppositions would be that myth could mediate between would be gods and humans, life and death, male and female. Lévi-Strauss claims that not just human culture, but human thought itself operates through these binary oppositions, and that many of our cultural structures and artifacts exist to mediate these oppositions. This form of structuralism developed as a subcategory, actually, of linguistics, because it was applied first to language and then expanded to include other systems like myth. Under Lévi-Strauss's structuralism, myth is seen as analogous to language. So, for instance, in phonetics, if we take the individual components of language, the phonemes, which have no inherent meaning of themselves, we must put a vowel in front of them or behind them in order to, or between them in order to make sense out of them. So if we take simply the sound k, okay, that has no meaning of in itself. Likewise, if we take the phoneme t, it has no meaning in and of itself. But if you put the vowel u, in front of, after the k and before the t, you get cut. Or if you put an a sound, you get a cat or a cot, and all the way on down. You start to have meaning when you link them together. So on the analogy of phonemes, which when you string them together in a meaningful way, they create a structure. The individual sounds mean nothing. Likewise, the mythemes, that is the term that he coined about this. That is the same thing with the components of myth. It is in their relationship one to another that conveys meanings. Okay, so the components of myth have no independent meaning by themselves. Oedipus by himself means nothing. It is only putting the components into relationship with one another that gives them meaning. One of Lévi-Strauss's most controversial claims connected with this is that a myth is made up of all of its variants. And by all of its variants, he means all of its variants, not just within the culture that developed it, but also within any culture that refers to it or uses it. Lévi-Strauss, for instance, says that Freud's interpretation of the Oedipus myth, to bring things back to that, is now part of the Oedipus myth. And therefore, if we are going to analyze the Oedipus myth, we have to take Freud into account no less than we have to take Sophocles into account. So he gives a very broad, elongated through time definition of what myth is. A more recent development in structuralism, kind of towards the latter half of the 20th century, came in the work of Walter Burckhardt, the same man whose definition of structuralism I quoted a few moments ago, who developed a structuralist approach that differs from both Propp's and Lévi-Strauss's in assigning the basic impetus for certain myths of what he calls biological programs of action. Burckhardt's theory resembles Propp's in that he isolates narrative elements that recur in different myths and different tales, and from them identifies certain types of tales. One example that Burckhardt gives is he calls the girl's tragedy. He finds this as a recurrent motif inside of myths cross-culturally. In this type of myth of the girl's tragedy, which is his term, as analyzed by Burckhardt, there is a sudden break in a girl's life which causes her to leave home. She then undergoes a period of seclusion, which comes to an end in some kind of violent encounter that could be with a god, It could sometimes even be with an animal, or it could also be with a human. And this violent encounter leaves her in some kind of this period of tribulation, of suffering, and of punishment. But at the end of the story, she is somehow made right. She is kind of reintegrated into society and often given a new and higher status in society. Burckhardt said basically like that these things are, it sounds very much like prop, doesn't it, right? Prop's thinking is that there, there's a different kind of parts of stories, and that, the recurrent elements that come with predictable transformations. What Burckhardt's contribution was, though, was to say that these kinds of parts of a story reflect underlying biological and sociological realities. The girl's tragedy is kind of emblematic, he said, of the stages of a girl's life, of puberty and maturation. That would be the sudden break, the kind of, maybe even, the period of tribute that comes where she has to leave whatever her house is, and then getting married and then having a child. This is kind of these moments of maturation and kind of and then being reintegrated back into society with the birth of a child and so on. These are different kind of biological and sociological realities that are sort of emblematized within the various elements of folk tales or myth. Burckhardt's thesis that these narrative elements are rooted in actual biological realities, and he traces them back, of course, believing in evolution, he traces them back even beyond early human, even to pre-human behaviors among animals and stuff. This is an idea that is controversial, to say the least, and by no means does every scholar accept this. But that is Burckhardt's main contribution. He also assigns great importance to ritual, particularly to initiation rituals, something like marriage. And so he is sometimes referred to as a neo-ritualist, as well as being a structuralist. And just to kind of wrapped up our litany here of these various different thinkers, at the end of the 20th century, the best known theorist, at least in America, the best known mythical sort of mythicist or theorist of myth to appear was Joseph Campbell. Now, Joseph Campbell is not nearly as popular now as he was in the late 20th century, which is too bad in a sense, because he has a lot of interesting things to say. And as I said, he was extremely popular at one point. Now, Campbell is oftentimes called a Jungian, and in some ways he shows many resemblances to Jung's theory of the archetypes of his work. A better term to describe his approach to myth might actually be something more like metaphysical. Campbell assumed that all myth is the same cross-culturally, that myth functions in the same way in every society, that myth reflects a reality of the human mind that is recognizable and is the same throughout cultures and across time. Like Fraser's, his method depends largely on gathering examples of narrative similarities from different cultures. And if anyone has ever seen his lectures, which you can watch on YouTube, or read his books, The Hero with a Thousand Faces is perhaps his most famous, you will, if anyone has heard him or read his books, you will remember that this is one of the main things that he does. He will cite examples of what he sees as the same narrative elements from many different cultures. He assumes that myth is true in a metaphysical or spiritual sense, and by that I mean to say that he imputes a spiritual meaning to myth, that he thinks it's that this meaning is constant across societies and across time. But he also says that it is crucial for individual psychological and spiritual health. In other words, Campbell sees the main function of myth as an expression of a particular spiritual reality in the human mind. That is what he thinks myth is. And one can see kind of, I would suppose that the most prominent sort of contemporary representative of this way of thinking would be Jordan Peterson and his lectures on mythology, which you can also listen to on YouTube. So rather than thinking that that myth is only understandable within a particular culture, which is, you remember what Malinowski had said. Campbell tends to say that myth is most understandable outside of a culture because the religious doctrines imposed by culture on that myth would be, he says, distortions of the real original spiritual meaning of the myth, which therefore can be gleaned better from outside the culture. Joseph Campbell, as I say, is an extremely engaging lecturer and author, and he was very popular towards the end of the 20th century. However, despite his popularity, most scholars do not have a very high opinion of Campbell's work. First of all, he never attempts any real rigorous demonstration of the validity of his interpretations of myth. Instead, he simply asserts his interpretations as givens. He assumes that all myths reflect one spiritual truth, or rather, he assumes kind of that there is one sort of interpretation that predominates across personality types and across cultures. Both of these assumptions are questionable, and even if we agree with them, it is not sufficient to simply assert such a position. As I often tell my students when I assign them term papers, assertion is not evidence. To simply say that something is so is not to give evidence of it. So Campbell doesn't actually give evidence of this assumption. He simply states his belief that myths reflect one sort of metaphysical reality, and then takes that as a given throughout his work. If you agree with him that it does, if you agree with his interpretation, then his work can be very compelling, and it was for many people. But if you don't agree, he never actually gives you any reason why you should. And I think one can also say the same thing for Jordan Peterson. Secondly, Campbell claims to be discussing narratives that occur worldwide, narratives he calls monomyths. He claims that the same mythic narrative occurs worldwide throughout cultures and throughout time. But he constructs these narratives by taking one narrative element from a story in one culture, another from a story in another culture, and yet a third from a story in yet another culture. He then puts them all together and says, here is the monomyth, here is the narrative, when in fact the underlying narrative that he has constructed does not exist in any single culture. It is a patchwork, a hodgepodge. Now, you may be thinking, well, wait a minute, isn't that what Vladimir Propp and Walter Burkhardt did? Yes, but there is a difference. Propp works exclusively within Russian folktale, within one culture, and finds the elements that make up his tale within one culture. And so does Burkhardt for his part. When he was talking about the maid's tragedy, the girl's tragedy, for instance, he was looking specifically and only about Greek culture. Campbell, though, Joseph Campbell, ranges across time and across culture. He'll take an element from Polynesia, another from a Native American myth, another from ancient Greek myth, and put them all together and says that they all refer to a monomyth, to a narrative structure that does not exist in any of those discrete cultures alone. That is very questionable methodology, not to say fatally flawed. And it is assumption that many scholars find themselves unable to follow him with. Campbell also tends to assume that mere multiplication of examples amounts to proof of his interpretation. So if he can find 10 of his examples of a hero going out and slaying a dragon, he assumes that this amounts to proof of his interpretation of what that narrative element means. But in fact, multiplication of examples and interpretation of what those examples mean are two very different things. It is a logical fallacy to simply think that a mere listing of examples actually proves something. That's not actually how it works. Mere listing of examples tells us nothing about the validity or lack of validity of any given interpretation of those examples. Finally, Campbell assumes that similar narrative elements must have precisely the same meanings in different cultures. And as I mentioned earlier on about snakes, that is a very, very questionable assumption to make. In ancient Greek mythology, just to use that example of the snake was actually considered to be a very positive symbol. It was a symbol of rebirth and of healing, because the snake sheds its skin every spring. and therefore it was seen as like a symbol of rebirth or of healing. That is why the healing god Asclepius, his symbol was a snake wrapped around a kind of staff, and the symbol that you can still see on the outside of every ambulance, if you've ever noticed that. Now, obviously, in the Bible, the snake is a symbol of evil, and so therefore that is the same symbol, the same I should say the same thing, but used to symbolize two very, very different ideas in different cultures. So that's one example. Let me give you another one from classical Greek myth, classical Athenian myth in particular, and contrasted with modern American culture. Amazons. Okay, Amazons were warrior women who fought against male warriors within Greek myth. They lived without males. Their name, the alpha in front of a word, means without. It's the alpha privative, like asexual reproduction or atheist or something like that. And Mazdon means breast. And so they are the ones without a breast, because according to myth, they removed their right breast so that they could fire their bows and arrows more efficiently. They did not depend on males to protect them or save them in any situation of violence. And in Greek myth, they appear all over the place. I will deal with them in a lecture later in this course. And in American culture, they have echoed down, as so many things of Greek myth have. In the late 90s, when I was still a young fellow, there was actually a show called Xena the Warrior Princess that basically was kind of like a it was basically like a show all about Amazons, but kind of made into a modern day myth. And it followed this Xena around, and she would go and attack men, and she had a bow and arrow, she had a sword, she was like tough person. Now, in modern American society, that was actually looked at as an affirmation of sort of feminist ideology. I even remember knowing people whose mothers made them watch that show, not made them, but encouraged them to watch that show because they wanted their daughters to kind of be imbued with the girl boss spirit. Whereas in ancient Greek society, Amazons were looked at as being frightening, as being horrifying, repulsive, and they were constantly overcome by heroes, male heroes, who basically had to put them back in their place and kind of subdue them. Okay, we're actually going to see that all over the place. In fact, one of the very words for wife, there's many of them in ancient Greek, but one of them, damar, is the word to tame or to subdue. Okay, that's and so it gives you something of an idea. So in other words, here we have the exact same mythological figure, but being used in one society to mean something altogether negative and repulsive, horrifying. But in the modern day American example, that same myth is being used and looked at in a positive way. Clearly, you could object to that and say Xena is not a myth in the sense that I have defined myth. This television program is intentionally written by modern American writers with an agenda, with an axe to grind, and fair enough. But what about the basic principle behind it, though? And then you can see the example I gave with the snake example as well. The same kind of imagery conjures up two totally different sets of beliefs or feelings inside of an audience. One is good, one is bad. So the assumption that symbols must mean exactly the same thing wherever they appear cross-culturally and across time is very dangerous as an assumption to make, and totally incorrect. I don't mean to pick too much on Joseph Campbell here, or even Jordan Peterson for that matter. I only focus on him and them because of the popularity of this approach, this kind of neo-Jungian sort of methodology or sort of way of looking at things, and because that is something that is one of the places where students of myth, modern day students of myth, they kind of hear about these different theories. And they are certainly very representative of the sort of universalist Y theories, as I've called them, in our day and age. These theories tend to rest on unproven and unprovable assumptions. If we just go back to the original ones that I mentioned now, Freud and Jung, let's take a look at the psychological theories of those two men. Both Freud and Jung espouse the idea that myths are in some sense the dreams of the people, that myth is to society as dream is to an individual. But what do they mean by that? This implies that a people or a society has the collective mind capable of dreaming. An idea which strikes me as very odd and certainly very problematic. Now, I have already said in my working definition that myths are stories a society tells itself, but that similarity of phraseology does not indicate a similarity of meaning here. When I say that myths are stories a society tells itself, that is shorthand for saying that myths are stories that a great many individuals within a society tells itself. Or just simply tell. When we say that a society believes in something, American society believes in freedom of speech or something like that, what we mean by that is that most individuals within society believe in freedom of speech. However, when Freud says myths are the dreams of a society, I don't think he simply means that individuals within that society have dreams. I think he is saying something else. I think he is positing that a society can somehow dream, just as an individual can. Now, if that's true on any level, it has to be true metaphorically, but then what does it really mean? If you're using a metaphor to try to explain myth, then you're not really doing much in terms of explanatory power, okay? A society cannot dream in a collective sense any more than a society can feel hunger or thirst or fall asleep in a collective sense. So Freud posits that myths are dreams of a society or function to a society as dreams function to an individual human. He doesn't ever demonstrate that, and this is my problem with all these theories. He assumes that the symbols in dreams and in myths have the same significance cross-culturally. We've talked about this a lot. And as I said before, one of the reasons why Freud has really just fallen out of favor so much and has for a very long time, really from the time of Jung on down, is because of his hyper-obsessiveness with sex, and how he uses sex to be kind of the he sees that as the motivating factor for all human endeavor, and this is just wrong. Okay, Jung understood that it was wrong. Others after him, Rank and other psychoanalysts, have also seen that as being wrong. Jung, for his part, posits the collective unconsciousness and the archetypes, again, never demonstrating that such things exist. Levi-Strauss assumes that the mediation of oppositions is the driving force of all cultures, and in fact underlies human thought itself, never demonstrating this either. So the objections I have to Campbell and his theory really apply to all of these why theories, including Walter Burckhardt. Burckhardt assumes that myth is rooted in pre-cultural biological necessity. Some people find that fascinating as a suggestion. I don't, but even if you do, it can only be asserted. It can never be proven. And therefore, where does that leave all of us with this? The best approach may be to recognize that myth is a varied category, a recognizable category. We all know it when we see it, but it is hard to pin down to any one theory. To put that a little less discouragingly, the best approach may be to recognize that myth can include all of these theories and more. No one theory that we have looked at, or of either the what category or the why category, seems to be sufficient to explain myth overall as a category. That does not mean that these theories can't be useful for elucidating individual myths at times, and they can be, and they certainly are. I would suggest that the best way to proceed would be to use these theories in conjunction with one another, to see what they can tell us about different myths, but not to try to force myths to fit the pattern of any one of them. It is fair to say that while these theories cannot be proven, they cannot be disproven either. There is no way to show that they are incorrect, and therefore they should and can be employed as tools when and where they are useful. My own working definition of myth, which I keep repeating as myths are traditional tales, stories that society tells itself that encode or represent the worldview, beliefs, principles, and fears of a society. That definition obviously combines elements from several other theories that we have discussed. I think that myths give us a great deal of insight on what a specific culture does think about the nature of the world in general, and about key elements within the world, and about key questions such as, what is the nature and function of humanity? Are there gods? What are they like? What do they do? The relationship that humans ought to have with the divine, what it means to be human, what marks us out from other creatures, and all of these kinds of questions. I tend to see the most interesting approach to myth as one that looks at myths within their originating culture and looks at what the myths can tell us about that culture, rather than looking at them in a more global view. Obviously, I find, therefore, the universalizing why theories of myth, psychological, structuralist, formalist, and so on, less useful than an approach that examines myth within the culture that developed it. That is my own personal view, and throughout this course, I will basically take that approach, although when appropriate, I will point out particular uses of the why theories, particular myths to which those theories have been applied, or to which I think they could usefully be applied, and I will discuss how they work at key points throughout the lectures. Well then, we have at this point finished our introductory material, our survey of what myth is and how it works. In the next lecture, we will turn to looking at the actual, looking at actual mythology itself, when we begin looking at the myth of the creation of the gods and the creation of the universe, as told in Hesiod's Theogony. Thank you.